Alicia never should have been in a men's prison, but now she was trapped, surrounded by dangers she couldn't escape. Every step was a fight for survival, every glance a silent threat. The warden saw her as an opportunity, the inmates saw her as prey, and the guards pretended not to see at all. She had no allies, no protection, except for Big J, a man with his own past and his own limits. When Warden Briggs gave her an ultimatum, she knew her time was running out. She could submit, or she could risk everything for a chance at freedom. With nothing left to lose, she made a desperate choice. The plan was reckless, the risks too high, but if she stayed, she wouldn't survive. As the prison doors locked behind her one final time, the question remained, would she make it out alive? Don't miss this intense, heart-pounding story. Subscribe now for more gripping tales. Alicia Carter never imagined her life would take such a devastating turn at just 22 years old. She had dreams, big ones. She was in college, studying to become a journalist, determined to tell the stories of the unheard. But now she was the story. Shackled, humiliated, and thrown into a nightmare she never could have predicted. It had all started with a simple mistake, one she didn't even make. A robbery at a gas station had left a clerk injured, and the police, desperate for a quick arrest, pinned it on her. She had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, just around the corner, withdrawing cash from an ATM. A witness, later proven unreliable, claimed she matched the suspect's description. That was all it took. The moment the police stopped her, she knew something was wrong. They weren't listening. They weren't interested in the truth. The trial was even worse. Alicia had never felt so invisible. Her public defender barely spoke up for her. The evidence was flimsy, the prosecution's arguments full of holes, but none of it mattered. The jury barely looked at her. The judge barely acknowledged her. When the verdict was read guilty, she felt the world collapse around her. 15 years. The words echoed in her ears as her mother sobbed in the courtroom. She wanted to scream, to fight, but she was too stunned, too broken. The real nightmare began when she was processed for prison. The officer reading her paperwork frowned, muttered something under his breath, and then smirked. It wasn't until the bus ride that she realized what had happened. There had been a clerical error. Instead of being sent to a women's correctional facility, she was being transferred to a maximum security men's prison. Her heart pounded as she sat in the prison transport van, squeezed between two menacing-looking inmates who stared at her with undisguised interest. The guard at the front kept his eyes on the road, indifferent to her fear. The chains around her wrists and ankles felt heavier with each passing mile. She tried to speak, to tell them there was a mistake, but no one listened. No one cared. When they arrived, the gates loomed like the mouth of a beast waiting to swallow her whole. The guards laughed when they saw her, a female prisoner in a men's facility. It was unheard of, and yet here she was. The warden himself came to inspect her, a tall man with cold, calculating eyes. He didn't look at her like a prisoner. He looked at her like an experiment, something to be observed and toyed with. The intake process was brutal. Stripped, searched, and handed an oversized jumpsuit, Alicia felt her dignity being peeled away layer by layer. The guards snickered as they led her down the halls, past rows of cells where men pressed against the bars, shouting, whistling, making crude remarks. Her stomach twisted, and she kept her eyes on the ground, afraid to meet their gazes. By the time she was locked in her cell, her body was trembling. The metal door slammed shut behind her, leaving her in a space barely big enough to stretch her arms. She could hear them, the voices, the laughter, the threats from nearby cells. Fear coiled around her like a vice, making it hard to breathe. She sat on the edge of the thin mattress, staring at the walls covered in scratches and markings from prisoners before her. She wondered how long she would last, how long before she broke, how long before someone decided she didn't belong there in the worst way possible. No one was coming to save her. The system had already abandoned her. The moment the heavy prison doors slammed shut behind her, Alicia felt her heart hammering in her chest. The air inside was thick, suffocating, carrying the stale stench of sweat, metal, and something else she couldn't quite place. Something rotten. The echo of her own footsteps against the cold concrete floor seemed too loud, but it was nothing compared to the sounds around her. Men's voices rang through the corridors, some laughing, some shouting, some murmuring in low, threatening tones. And then there were the eyes. Everywhere she turned, she could feel them watching her. Hungry, curious, predatory. Some inmates pressed against the bars of their cells, grinning as she passed. Others whispered among themselves, their expressions unreadable. Alicia forced herself to keep walking, head down, arms wrapped tightly around her body, as if that alone could shield her from whatever nightmare awaited. A guard nudged her forward roughly, muttering something under his breath. She didn't respond. What was the point? No one had listened to her since the moment they put the cuffs on her. She was an anomaly here, a mistake lost in a place where mistakes were never corrected. They led her down a long, dimly lit hallway until they reached a cell at the very end. The steel bars screeched as the door was pulled open. "Welcome home," the guard sneered before shoving her inside. The door clanged shut behind her, the sound final, like a nail being driven into a coffin. She turned slowly, taking in the tiny space. A thin mattress rested on a metal frame bolted to the wall, barely covered by a tattered blanket. A small toilet sat in the corner. No privacy, no separation. Graffiti and deep scratches marred the walls, evidence of the men who had lived here before her. Some messages were crude, others filled with rage. One word stood out, carved deep into the wall beside her bed. "Run!" A chill ran through her, but there was nowhere to run. She sat down on the bed, her body tense, her hands clenched into fists. She wanted to cry, but she wouldn't let herself. Crying wouldn't help her survive. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The prison never truly went silent. The voices continued, laughter and threats blending into a terrifying symphony. The scent of sweat and something foul drifted through the air, making her stomach churn. Then, a voice. "Hey, sweetheart," someone called from a nearby cell. "You need some company?" More laughter, more whispers. Her heart pounded. She didn't answer. Another voice, deeper and more menacing. "You ain't gonna last long in here, girl. Not without help." Alicia curled her arms around herself, pressing her back against the cold wall. She shut her eyes, trying to block out the voices, the taunts, the terrifying reality of where she was. She had survived her first night in hell. But she knew this was just the beginning. Alicia sat on the edge of her bed, her back pressed against the cold cement wall, arms wrapped tightly around herself. She had barely slept the night before. Every sound, every cough, every distant scream, every shuffle of footsteps had kept her on edge. She had never known fear like this. It wasn't just the fear of being hurt. It was the fear of being completely powerless, of being nothing more than an object, trapped in a place where no one cared whether she lived or died. The morning brought no relief. The guards made their rounds, banging on the metal bars to signal breakfast. Alicia hesitated, unsure of whether to leave her cell. The thought of stepping into a crowded room filled with men who had already spent the night taunting her made her stomach churn. But staying locked inside wasn't an option either. If she showed weakness, they'd see it. They'd use it. She forced herself to stand. Her hands trembled as she stepped into the corridor, joining the flow of prisoners being herded toward the mess hall. She kept her head down, moving quickly, her senses on high alert. The moment she entered, the smell of food, if it could even be called that, hit her. Watery oatmeal, stale bread, something that vaguely resembled eggs. The prisoners gathered in groups, some laughing, some shoving each other, some simply staring. And then there was the warden, standing at the far end of the room, observing everything with a quiet intensity. Warden Briggs was an imposing man, tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp, piercing eyes that seemed to see right through people. He had been running the prison for over a decade, and his reputation was well known. He was strict, ruthless, and completely indifferent to suffering. He ruled with absolute authority, and the prisoners feared him almost as much as they feared each other. Alicia could feel his gaze on her as she walked toward the food line. She didn't dare look up, but she knew he was watching, studying. She grabbed a tray, her hands still unsteady, and moved toward an empty table in the corner. Just as she sat down, a shadow loomed over her. "You in the wrong place, girl," a voice sneered. She looked up to see a tall, muscular inmate with tattoos running down his arms. He wasn't alone. 2 others flanked him, their expressions amused. "New girl sits where we tell her to sit," he continued, placing his hands on the table. Alicia's pulse quickened. She knew she had two choices: comply and let them control her, or stand her ground and risk the consequences. Before she could respond, another voice cut in. "She's with me." The group turned. Behind them stood Warden Briggs. His expression was unreadable, but there was something unsettling in his eyes. The men hesitated before backing away, muttering under their breaths. Alicia swallowed hard, unsure whether to feel relieved or even more afraid. "You're a special case," Briggs said, his voice low, "and special cases need special rules." A chill ran through her. She didn't know what he meant, but she knew one thing for certain: whatever protection he was offering came with a price. Alicia sat frozen as Warden Briggs walked away, his words lingering in the air like an unspoken threat. She wasn't sure what kind of special rules he meant, but she had no doubt they wouldn't be in her favour. Nothing in this place was. She forced herself to eat, shoveling small bites of the tasteless food into her mouth while keeping her eyes on her tray. She could still feel the stares from the other prisoners, their curiosity mixed with something far more dangerous. She had survived another encounter, but she knew it wouldn't be her last. As she left the mess hall, she kept close to the walls, trying to make herself as invisible as possible. But in a prison full of men, she was anything but. Every step felt like she was walking through a minefield, waiting for one wrong move to set off an explosion she couldn't escape. Back in the cell block, she was about to enter her cell when a voice stopped her. "You got a target on your back, girl." She turned. A large, middle-aged man with greying hair and deep scars on his arms leaned against the wall a few feet away. Unlike the others, his gaze wasn't full of amusement or predatory interest. It was full of warning. "Who are you?" she asked cautiously. "James," he said. "Big J, they call me." He studied her for a moment before shaking his head. "You ain't going to last long in here if you don't learn how things work." Alicia swallowed, glancing around. The hallway was mostly empty, but she knew that eyes and ears were everywhere. "And what exactly do I need to learn?" Big J let out a low chuckle. "First thing, never sit alone in the mess hall. That was a mistake." She frowned. "I didn't have a choice." "You always got a choice," he said. "In here, it's about who you got watching your back, and right now, you got nobody." Alicia knew he was right. She had no allies, no protection. And while Warden Briggs had interfered today, she doubted he had done it out of kindness. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Big J sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. "Because I seen too many people get eaten alive in this place. And you? You don't belong here. Everyone knows it. That makes you a prize. Some of these guys," he trailed off, his expression darkening, "they're already planning." Her stomach twisted. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a wave of panic through her. "So what do I do?" "You got to find people to stand with you," Big J said. "Or at least, you got to make them think you got someone watching your back." Alicia hesitated. Trust wasn't something she could afford, but neither was isolation. "I don't have anyone," she admitted. Big J studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Then maybe it's time you do." She didn't know if she could trust him, but right now he was the only person who wasn't looking at her like she was prey. And in this place, that might be the closest thing to a friend she could get. Alicia had learned quickly that prison was a game of survival, and she was playing with a losing hand. Every move had to be calculated, every step taken with caution. Big J had warned her that she needed protection, and while she was grateful for his advice, she wasn't naive. Help in this place always came with a price. For a few days, things were quiet, too quiet. She knew that meant something was coming, and she wasn't wrong. It happened in the yard. Alicia had been keeping her distance from the crowds, staying close to Big J when she could, but he wasn't always around. That day, as she sat on a bench near the far side of the yard, she noticed the group of men before they got too close. 3 of them. The same ones who had confronted her in the mess hall days ago. "Thought you'd be smarter," the tallest one said, cracking his knuckles as he stepped forward. "You think the warden's going to protect you forever?" Alicia stood up slowly, her pulse pounding in her ears. She knew there were guards watching from the towers, but that didn't mean they'd step in. Sometimes they let things happen just for the entertainment. "I don't want trouble," she said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. The man smirked. "Yeah? Well, trouble found you. Before she could react, one of them grabbed her arm, yanking her forward. Instinct kicked in, and she struggled, twisting against his grip. A sharp pain shot through her wrist as he tightened his hold, and panic flared in her chest. Then, just as suddenly as they had grabbed her, they let go. Alicia stumbled back, breathing hard, and when she looked up, Big J was standing between her and them. "You want to pick a fight?" he growled. "Pick it with me." The three men hesitated. Big J wasn't the biggest guy in the prison, but he had something far more dangerous: respect. He had been inside for years, long enough to have built a reputation. Messing with him wasn't worth it. After a tense moment, the men backed off, throwing Alicia one last look before disappearing into the crowd. Alicia exhaled shakily. "You didn't have to do that." Big J turned to her, his expression serious. "Yeah, I did." She didn't understand why he had taken her under his wing, but she wasn't going to question it. She was still here, still breathing because of him. Later that night, as she lay on her cot staring at the ceiling, she heard voices outside her cell, low, hushed, but urgent. She couldn't make out the words, but she knew they were talking about her. And then she heard Warden Briggs's name. A chill ran through her. Something wasn't right. And whatever it was about to get worse. Alicia had learned to trust her instincts, and right now they were screaming at her. Something was coming. She had spent enough time in this place to recognize the tension in the air, the way inmates whispered in corners and exchanged glances when they thought she wasn't looking. She didn't know what they were planning, but she knew it involved her. The next morning, the guards came for her. "Carter, on your feet," one of them barked, rattling the bars of her cell. She sat up, her body stiff from another restless night. "Where am I going?" "Warden wants to see you," the guard said, unlocking the door. Alicia's stomach tightened. She had only seen Warden Briggs a handful of times since the mess hall incident, but each time there had been something unsettling in his gaze. He watched her too closely, spoke in riddles that left her uneasy. She considered refusing, but what good would that do? The guards had all the power here. With a deep breath, she rose to her feet and stepped out of her cell, her wrists immediately cuffed. They led her down the long corridor, past cells filled with men who stared at her with varying expressions, some curious, some amused, some dark with intent. As she walked, she caught sight of Big J standing near the back of the common area. His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw something in them she hadn't before: concern. He knew. Whatever was happening, he knew. But he couldn't stop it. The guards took her through a set of heavy doors leading to the administrative wing. The air felt different here, quieter, colder. She was led into Warden Briggs' office, a dimly lit room lined with bookshelves and a large wooden desk at the center. The blinds were half closed, allowing only slivers of light to filter through. Briggs sat behind his desk, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes sharp as they studied her. "Have a seat, Carter," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. She hesitated, then slowly lowered herself into the seat, her muscles tense. The guards stepped back but didn't leave. Briggs leaned forward. "You've been here for a little while now," he said, "long enough to understand how things work." Alicia said nothing, waiting. "You're an anomaly," he continued. "A woman in a men's prison, a mistake, some might say, but mistakes can be opportunities." Her pulse quickened. "I don't understand." Briggs smirked. "Oh, I think you do." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. "You don't have any protection here, Carter, and we both know what happens to prisoners who don't have protection." She clenched her fists. Big J can't protect you forever," Briggs interrupted, his voice smooth but firm. "Not from the people who are interested in you." Her stomach twisted. "And you?" she asked, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Are you one of those people?" Briggs chuckled, standing up. He walked around the desk, stopping behind her chair. She felt his presence looming over her, his shadow stretching across the desk. "I'm offering you a choice," he said. "Be smart, Carter. Align yourself with me and you'll survive. Reject me." He trailed off, letting the silence speak for itself. Alicia's skin crawled. She had seen this game before. It wasn't about survival. It was about control. And he wanted to own her. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had no allies, no escape, no power, but she wasn't going to break. Not yet. She forced herself to nod. "I understand. Briggs smiled. Good. But as he dismissed her and the guards led her back to her cell, she knew one thing for certain. She had just made a deal with the devil. Back in her cell, Alicia sat on the edge of the thin mattress, staring at the wall but seeing nothing. Warden Briggs' words replayed in her mind, each one laced with a hidden threat. She had given him an answer, but it wasn't the truth. She hadn't agreed to anything. She had only bought herself time. But time was running out. The air in the prison felt different now, heavier, charged with an energy she couldn't quite place. She knew the men were watching her even more closely. Some with amusement, others with something far more dangerous. They had seen her being escorted to the warden's office, and now they were wondering what it meant. Big J found her that evening. She had been sitting on the floor of her cell, her back against the cold metal bars, when she heard his voice from the other side. What did he want? She looked up to see him standing there, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp. She hesitated, then whispered, "He wants me under his protection." Big J let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. "And what did you say?" "I told him what he wanted to hear." His gaze darkened. "That's dangerous, girl. You don't play games with men like Briggs." Alicia exhaled shakily. "What choice do I have? If I refuse, I'm a target. If I agree, I belong to him. Either way, I lose." Big J crouched down, lowering his voice. "Listen to me. You ain't the first person he's done this to. He picks the vulnerable ones, makes them think he's their only way out, but he don't protect people for free." She clenched her fists. "I know." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "You need an out." Alicia's breath hitched. "There is no out." "There might be," he said carefully, "but you gotta trust me." She wanted to. But trust in this place was a rare currency, and she wasn't sure she could afford it. Before she could answer, a voice interrupted. "Carter?" A guard called from the end of the hall. "Warden wants you again." Her stomach turned to ice. Big J stiffened. "You sure you want to walk through that door?" She swallowed hard, then stood. "I don't have a choice." He didn't argue, but as she was led away, she saw something in his eyes that sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Regret. As if he already knew what was waiting for her on the other side of that door, and that whatever it was, it would change everything. Alicia's footsteps echoed through the long corridor as the guard led her back to Warden Briggs' office. Her heart pounded, but she kept her face neutral. Showing fear in this place was like bleeding in a pool of sharks. She had no idea what the warden wanted this time, but she knew one thing. She couldn't afford to be weak. The guard stopped outside the office, unlocked the door, and motioned for her to enter. She stepped inside, and the door shut behind her with a heavy thud. Briggs sat behind his desk, his expression calm, almost amused. The room was dimly lit, the smell of stale coffee lingering in the air. He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. "You're learning," he said, watching her with those calculating eyes. "Caution is a good trait in here." Alicia's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Why am I here?" Briggs leaned back, folding his hands together. "Because it's time for you to make a real decision." She forced herself to stay still. "I thought I already did." He smirked. "Telling me what I want to hear isn't the same as choosing a side." His voice lowered. "And you need to choose." Alicia's pulse quickened. She had known this moment would come, but she had no plan, no way out. She had spent days navigating the dangers of this prison, surviving each moment as it came. But now survival wasn't enough. Briggs stood, walking around the desk until he was just a few feet away. "You think you can make it on your own in here?" he asked, tilting his head. "You think Big J can protect you forever?" Alicia held her breath. "You're out of options," Briggs continued. "Either you take my protection or you take your chances with them." He gestured vaguely toward the rest of the prison. "And trust me, Carter, you won't last long." Her mind raced. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to fight, but how? What power did she have? Then an idea. A desperate one. She forced herself to relax, softening her posture just slightly. "And if I say yes," Briggs' smirk widened, "then you'll be safe. You'll have privileges, a way to make this place easier for yourself." Alicia nodded slowly. Briggs studied her as if trying to decide whether she was bluffing. Not too much time. She met his gaze. "Tomorrow." For a long moment he said nothing. Then finally he nodded. "Tomorrow." She turned and walked out. keeping her step steady even though her entire body was trembling. The moment she reached her cell, she found Big J waiting. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low. She took a deep breath. "I bought us one day." His eyes narrowed. "For what?" "For a way out." Big J stared at her for a moment, then exhaled. "Then we better move fast." The plan came together in whispers that night. The guards would be watching. Briggs would be expecting her to submit. But instead, she would be gone. By dawn, the prison would wake up to an empty cell. By the time they realized what had happened, she would no longer be theirs to control. She would be free.